Almost everyone knows the disappointing saga that is Duke Nukem Forever, and if you're one of the few that are unaware, then please allow me to enlighten you. Way back in the 90s, there was a spunky little side-scroller called Duke Nukem. It was developed by Apogee Software, who would eventually become 3D Realms. It did pretty well for its time, spawning a sequel and eventually jumping into 3D in 1996 with the fittingly titled Duke Nukem 3D. This is generally the last game people think about when they hear the name Duke Nukem. Well, the last good game, at least. Duke Nukem 3D sat amongst the greats, up there with Wolfenstein and Doom as one of the original first-person shooters, but it differentiated itself enough with risque toilet humor and Big Booba.
We should replace COVID-19 with boobs.
It also solidified Duke's over-the-top, tough-as-nails badass persona. Duke Nukem Forever is responsible for stuff like this. Duke Nukem 3D was a smash hit, so much so that Scott Miller, one of the founders of 3D Realms, believed that Duke would become a cultural icon and a video game mainstay. The sequel to Duke Nukem 3D was announced on April 27, 1997. This would end up being the ill-fated Duke Nukem Forever. Duke Nukem Forever would spend 15 years in development hell, going through multiple engine changes, staff layoffs, developer disputes, and nearly being cancelled before finally being released on May 3rd, 2011. For as revolutionary as Duke Nukem 3D was, Duke Nukem Forever was not. It tried to modernize in just all the wrong places, and it still felt like it had one foot back in 1996. Gameplay had been slowed down to try and match the more grounded modern shooters like Halo and Call of Duty, and the level design had been drastically dumbed down from Duke Nukem 3D. Taking the fun, arena-like levels that boomer shooters are known for and just turning them into linear paths where you walk from point A to point B, shooting any alien baddie that comes your way. Another major critique of Duke Nukem Forever was the game's sense of humor. Duke Nukem 3D did have a lot of adult-oriented jokes and was pretty popular because of this. However, this did draw some controversy, especially with how the game treated women. Duke Nukem 3D has not aged well in this department, and much to its own demise, Duke Nukem Forever followed in the footsteps of its predecessor. The humor went from edgy and at times a bit witty to just schlocky and embarrassing. This is going to be some low-hanging fruit, but the game really does feel like it was written by a 14-year-old boy.
Strange silicone-based life form.
Upon its release, Duke Nukem Forever, one of the most anticipated games in history, was just washed away. Glad nothing like this has happened with any other games. Am I right? Now the legacy of the once great Duke Nukem is nothing more than crusty voiceovers on impact font shitposts. But recently, something pretty amazing happened. With a little glimmer and a dash of hope, we got to see a look behind the scenes at what Duke Nukem Forever could have possibly been. On May 9th, a 4chan user going by the name Zor uploaded screenshots and gameplay footage of what appeared to be an early build of Duke Nukem Forever, specifically the 2001 E3 build of the game. The creator of Duke Nukem, George Broussard, even validated the leak's authenticity on Twitter, saying, "Yes, the leak looks real. No, I'm not really interested in talking about it or retreading a painful past. You should heavily temper expectations. There is no real game to play, just a smattering of barely populated test levels. I have no knowledge who leaked this." Zor stated in the initial leak that they wanted to release the build sometime in June, but on May 11th, just 2 days later, a download of the build surfaced online. It contained multiple, albeit unfinished levels, but also the entire source code for the game, as well as the level editors that the developers used when designing the game. This was a major moment for Duke Nukem fans, gaming historians, and anyone interested in the downfall of one of the most hyped up games in the entire video game industry. And that's what we're going to take a look at today. We will become explorers, treading through this game's forgotten halls, trying to discover what could have been and what went wrong. As I said earlier, one of the reasons behind Duke Nukem Forever's rocky development was the fact that the game switched between multiple different engines during its 15-year development time. This specific build is the one showcased at E3 2001, 4 years into the game's development and 3 years after the game was ported from the Quake 2 engine to the Unreal Engine. Surprisingly, everything runs pretty well and is surprisingly stable, aside from some occasional crashes, and, as you can probably tell, some very obvious graphical bugs. I want to preface this by saying I have seen some other footage of this build where these graphical bugs aren't present, so I'm just going to chalk this up to me setting up the game improperly. Also, at seemingly random points throughout the game, Duke will run and act way faster than normal, giving him super fast movement and letting him fire any weapon like it was a machine gun. Again, not sure if this is just a quirk with the build or an issue from improper setup. A surprising amount of the game is playable, with 18 episodes available from the game's menu that each have multiple levels in them, and countless others buried in the game's files. The majority of these levels are unfinished, and the ones that aren't selectable from the game's main menu are just simple test levels. Most of the settings don't work properly, and if you save the game and try to load your file, the game will just crash. There are also a handful of placeholder graphics, some of which are interesting to say the least. Comparing this build to the final release, there are a handful of elements that made it into the final game in one way or another. Most notably is the ego bar. In the final game, ego functioned similarly to shields in most other shooters. The more damage Duke took, the more his ego dropped. Letting all of Duke's ego drop would cause him to take damage, but avoiding damage for a while would allow his ego to recharge. In this build, ego is Duke's actual health, and he can replenish it by eating food or killing enemies. Much of the environment is also interactable, which was a big focal point in the final game, for better or worse.
What kind of sick motherfucker picks up wet feces?
We can also see some semblance of how the original story was going to pan out and how that differs from the final game. In the final release, Duke is alerted to the alien invasion by the President and General Graves and is more of your stock standard alien shoot-'em-up. This early version of the game seems to take a different, more horror-themed approach to the invasion. Things hit the fan more suddenly, and the classic Duke enemies are largely replaced with SWAT and military, obviously infected with some form of alien parasite, as you can tell from the multitude of tentacles coming from their bodies. Aside from a half-finished news story you can find on Duke's TV, we don't know how or why the invasion started, as there's nothing in this build that provides any context. The first episode of the game, The Lady Killer, is the most complete part of this build, and is quite similar aesthetically to how it appears in the final game. While in the final game, Duke spent most of his time driving around in a little tiny toy car, this early version stays true to standard FPS style and gameplay. There are also elements present from the levels Damn It's Late and the Duke Cave seen in the final release of the game. An early build of the Damn It's Late talk show is present, missing many different features. All of the dialogue is represented by text in the top left of the screen. There's no actual recorded voiceover. And when you reach the studio stage, there's no scripted events or even a crowd. Just two NPCs, which I think are named after Jay Leno and Andy Richter. Also, if you kick this plant beside the desk, the game will instantly crash. Parts from the Duke Cave play out very differently from how they do in the final game. In the final release, much of this segment is just walking. It was a way to build up the story and allow the player to interact with different aspects of the environment. While in this early build, things are much faster paced. There are explosions, fires, and tons more combat encounters than there are in the final game. There's even a full rooftop segment where Duke fights his way through waves of infected EDF soldiers, and a puzzle where you have to flip all the circuit breakers to start the elevator to get to Duke's study. Unfortunately, as with the talk show segment, much of this is unfinished. Sections of the levels are isolated, and there are few, if any, level transitions. The whole part with the elevator doesn't even work, forcing you to manually select the next part of the game if you want to progress. Getting into the Duke Cave itself is normally impossible in this build. The secret door requires an access code, but this code isn't present anywhere in the entire game. Luckily, this build features a full debug console, which you can use to turn on NoClip and enter the Duke Cave. As you enter the cave, Duke gets a call from General Graves, similar to the one in the final version. However, instead of informing Duke of the invasion, it's just some filler dialogue about a night vision upgrade for Duke's shades, and it is hilariously done in crappy text-to-speech.
General Graves here. I've got good news, Duke. You won't need to blunder around in the dark anymore.
Compared to the final game, the Duke computer is also very different. It's much more scaled down in scope and prominently features a female Max Headroom parody instead of its generic sci-fi appearance in the final game. There's also one of those Bioshock pipe puzzles down here, but it goes way too fast to solve, and I didn't have enough patience to try and do it. The rest of the level itself is pretty standard. Duke travels through the Lady Killer Casino, fighting any enemies he runs into before exiting into the Las Vegas Strip. We can see some really cool moments and set pieces the developers had planned. Like at the end of this burning section of the hotel, a Terminator-esque robot with minigun arms busts through the wall. It doesn't do anything, but at least there is a test level where we can see it move around in all of its glory. I also can't forget this buffet section where you're supposed to skillfully dodge these trip mines, but thanks to God mode, I just bumbled through them like a fool. Lost Wages is the next episode, and is where things get simultaneously more and less interesting. This is where the player ends up after escaping the Lady Killer Hotel, and while there is a lot to explore, there really isn't anything to actually do. All you'll find in this level are just set pieces. Massive, sprawling alleyways and casino parking lots populated by just a handful of NPCs. Yeah, this is boring because there's nothing to do, but it's sections of the game like this that I particularly enjoy, especially when you look at what the development team was going through at this time. At this point, Duke Nukem Forever had already been delayed multiple times, and the switch from the Quake 2 engine to the Unreal Engine meant that development pretty much just had to start over. On top of just rebuilding their game, they also had to learn a new game development engine that had just hit the market, causing even more massive delays. Development issues aside, there were also numerous issues happening inside of the company itself. Thanks to the delays, GT Interactive, the company who owned the publishing rights to Duke Nukem, had lost a significant amount of money and were looking to sell off the company. Infogrames Entertainment purchased controlling interest in GT Interactive and then passed the publishing rights on to Gathering of Developers. When you know the real struggles behind the development of Duke Nukem Forever, this early build starts to paint an interesting picture. The barren streets and gigantic parking lots are the devs trying their hardest to learn this new engine and make something of mind-blowing scale and scope. Something truly revolutionary. Something that would hopefully save their careers. Sadly, that wouldn't be the case, and by 2003, the Duke Nukem Forever dev team would be downsized to only 18 people. Leaving Las Vegas is the next episode, and is by far one of the most incomplete, but features a mechanic that is one of the most interesting. This is the first of multiple motorcycle sequences in the game, and consists of Duke riding a motorcycle down a dimly lit Las Vegas highway. That's about all it has going for it. There are no enemies, other NPCs, nor any scripted special events. The actual motorcycle driving mechanics are also in a very early state. Tapping the A or D keys while driving makes Duke spin like a madman. You can actually get some more control if you steer with the mouse, but I didn't realize this until I was well into my playthrough. The next episode is the Slick Willie. Events here take place across two major locations, the One Night Stand Motel and the Slick Willie Strip Club. It seems this level would pick up where Leaving Las Vegas ended, but Duke doesn't arrive at the motel on his bike. Instead, it seems like he's dropped off by a car driven by a robot chauffeur. The motel area is fairly small, but there are quite a few rooms that you can explore, and a good bit of tasteful placeholder dialogue. Talking to this NPC sitting outside also reveals that there was going to be a sort of puzzle here where Duke had to search various places around the map to find a set of keys so he could get into the garage at the start of the level and turn on the gas pumps. But of the three areas this NPC tells you to search, the vending machine's pool and a vibrating bed, none of them have any keys. So completing this level is impossible. The next section of this level, I would assume, takes place inside the garage where Duke stopped. Largely, there's not really a whole lot going on here. Design-wise, the level seems mostly put together. There are some garage buildings and junked cars, but not much else is going on. There are also a couple of these boar-like enemies here, but you aren't able to kill them, at least not with the limited amount of ammo you start the level with. This is also where the player first finds the Slick Willie. After traveling down this excessively long and dark road, you end up at the club, but for Duke to get inside, he needs to know the special knock. As far as I can tell, there's no way to actually learn the special knock. I assume you'd learn it from this guy who's going absolutely beast mode on this door, but I couldn't find a way to get to him. No clipping into the strip club, there's actually a fully programmed sequence where Duke has to leave behind all of his weapons and gear to enter the club. Don't get excited because you won't be seeing any boobies, because the load zone that should bring you into the club itself just doesn't work. The next section of this level drops Duke at the back door of the club. At first blush, it may look like there's not much to do here. Just a couple of trailers and that's it. But there's a really cool action sequence here that's more or less fully programmed. Entering this trailer triggers an event where Duke is locked inside and hit by a volley of explosions and bullets. Clipping outside of the trailer actually reveals a pretty cool trick. As the bombs go off, the player is pulled to a totally separate trailer interior in a different part of the map. This is a pretty common thing a lot of developers do when programming and scripting events like this. After the Slick Willy comes Stratosphere, a surprisingly fleshed out level that is largely absent from the final game. Though, however, the Stratosphere Tower does make an appearance in the final game, though it's largely scaled down in scope. During the level Crash Course, Duke falls from an EDF gunship and lands on a skyscraper that bears a striking resemblance to the Stratosphere Tower. While the graphical issues make it hard to tell, Duke is headed into Las Vegas again after presumably escaping the strip club. After being dropped off at the entrance to the Stratosphere Mall, Duke is ambushed by numerous EDF soldiers. The mall entrance doesn't have much to explore, but there is a pretty neat scripted event here where this wrecking ball busts open a hole in the wall. Entering the mall, Duke has a firefight with another EDF squad and is left to explore a section of the mall that appears to be undergoing a remodel. There's a lot of in-progress construction and many of the stores lack noticeable features or furniture. Going through this door, you can enter a hallway that is for some reason filled with poisonous gas and even more trip mines. I can only assume that this was going to be another ambush segment and the developers just hadn't got around to adding the enemies. This hall connects to what looks like some kind of unfinished office space. Again, environmentally, there's not a lot going on, but there are some really interesting aliens scattered about. There are a couple really disturbing tentacles and some kind of big roach-looking monster. None of them have any proper programming, and the animations for the tentacles run at about Mach 10. There are a couple more mall segments in this build, but to be honest, they just don't really have anything cool or interesting going on with them, aside from a couple combat encounters, I guess. The next interesting part of this build is the Stratosphere Tower, and it's split into two parts, the tower base and the tip of the tower itself. Based on visuals alone, the tower base has the most going on. There's a lot of sectioned off areas and decorations, but in terms of actual content, there's practically nothing. This level loads directly into the actual tower, which appears to be a very, very early version of some sort of obstacle course. The player is supposed to pick up a nearby jetpack and use it to fly up to the top of the tower, dodging tons of trip mines and some lightning. When I say this is an early version of this level, I mean it. The trip mine lasers move insanely fast, making them nearly impossible to dodge, and the jetpack itself doesn't even have enough fuel to reach the top of the tower. Luckily, with little help from the debug console, that's an easy problem to solve. This all culminates with Duke reaching the tip of the Stratosphere Tower and fighting what is easily the single greatest boss in the entire history of video games ever. Obviously, this is a joke, and this boss is a placeholder, but you can't deny this looks hysterical. With how spotty and barren sections of this build can be, it's absolutely fascinating to see this much of a boss fight actually programmed. With how basic this boss looks, it's hard to tell who or what this is supposed to be, but from the obvious human head, this could be Dr. Proton, the antagonist from the original Duke Nukem game, who did actually make a return in the Doctor Who Clone Me DLC for the final game. But, of course, this is just speculation. This Is Not a Boating Accident is the next episode after Stratosphere and looked to be a pretty promising set piece if it actually came to fruition. What's here in this build isn't much of anything. You board the boat, find a machine gun, and try to shoot down some EDF jets. On top of that, all the textures are extremely bugged out, which makes actually playing this level utterly impossible. Power Struggle and Countdown to Destruction are the next two episodes, taking place on the exterior and the interior of the Hoover Dam. These levels are probably the biggest carryover to the final build of the game. Close to a third of Duke Nukem Forever takes place at the Hoover Dam itself, so it's obvious this part was really important to the developers. This level picks up directly after the Lake Mead boat segment. Duke is dropped off at the dam by who appears to be General Graves and quickly engages with EDF forces that have taken control of the dam. That's about all we can really glean from what little story this build has. It's a major difference from the final game, where Duke spends a majority of his time driving himself to the dam in his monster truck. No clipping out of bounds, we can see that a lot of scenery is rendered out, way more than what the player would normally see. A lot of the map is laid out here, and the Hoover Dam itself is fully realized in breathtaking scale. A lot of these levels take place in this main dam map, and the game loads a new segment whenever the new level is selected. These surface segments lean heavily into the tourist trap aspect of the Hoover Dam. There are gift shops, a theater, and a fairly detailed museum that you can explore. I prefer these levels way more than the later ones, which take place inside of the dam itself. The whole tourist attraction design is way more unique than the latter levels, which primarily have an industrial look to them. And with how utterly massive the exterior levels are, the interior levels are much smaller, more segmented, and way more claustrophobic. The best exception to this is the final interior segment. This transformer room is pretty large and has a good amount of detail to explore. Making your way up this ladder, you can even interact with this crane that I assume was to be used in some kind of puzzle, probably one involving these little robo-lads that are floating next to the transformers. For something that is so obviously important to the overall plot, there is very little that is here in terms of gameplay. After the Hoover Dam levels is another barely finished motorcycle sequence. There is a bit more to this one than the one that takes place in Las Vegas, though. A couple motorcycle cops spawn, as well as a helicopter and a few haywire missiles. There's even a stunt jump towards the end of the level, but don't worry if you miss the ramp though. Duke's bike will magically levitate right over the train that's blocking the road. In the final release of Duke Nukem Forever, there is a level where Duke drives his monster truck through a very similar desert environment, so it's possible this early motorcycle segment is the very, very early beginnings of this monster truck moment.
This is a certified monster truck moment.
This bike sequence leads into the episode Heatwave, and is where the build goes from partially finished to a complete unfinished buggy mess. The first section of this level is an extremely open desert highway. Multiple spots in the map lead right out of bounds where you can very easily fall to your death. There are a couple points of interest around the map, like this tasteful billboard for a radio station or this interestingly textured donkey. In all seriousness, there's just not much here. This level is largely unfinished and it reuses a lot of assets from the previous motorcycle section. The name for this specific level is Gus Encounter. It's pretty obvious Duke was intended to meet someone named Gus. Specifically this someone named Gus. This character doesn't appear at all in the final game, but he does appear in the next level, which we will get to shortly. Just from this next level alone, I wish this version of Duke Nukem Forever would have seen the light of day. For some reason, you start the level riding a donkey. Why? Who knows? But seeing this fully realized in the final game would have easily made for an hilarious moment. The donkey only goes for a couple minutes before hitting an invisible wall, and as with everything else in this build, the messed up textures take up the entire screen. After the donkey ride is a very interesting looking level. I'm not sure why everything is so washed out, but my guess is this is supposed to be the set for some kind of cutscene. I'm only guessing this because of just how large this level is, and because there's another equally large set piece map like this later in the build that does this same weird color overlay thing. Next up are probably two of my most favorite sections in this entire build, and they're nothing more than just some maps for an abandoned mining facility. At least that's what the game refers to them as. Really, there's not a lot here. On one of them there's a tornado and there's some enemies on the other, and that's about it. It's just a lot of abandoned areas where you just walk around and explore. But it's levels like these that really show what the developers had in store, and it's just really cool to see this early piece of the development process. The devs likely had some grand ambitions for these maps. There was a surprising amount of detail crammed inside and a lot of nooks and crannies to explore. Walking around these maps is like exploring some kind of ancient ruins or a museum. So much history lies in these digital walls that we will probably never, ever see. Runaway Minecart is the last part of the Heatwave episode, and the name is pretty accurate. You start in a minecart, ride it for a few seconds, and then plummet quickly to a rocky death. That's pretty much it. It looks like there might actually be some more to this level, but you can't get out of the minecart in any way, even with no clip or fly, and even if you turn on God mode, Duke still dies. So that's really all there is for this section. The next episode is Ghost Town, which consists of 5 levels tastefully named Morningwood. Things start off with Duke dismounting his minecart and crossing a bridge into the abandoned town of Morningwood. This section actually makes it into the final game in a few different forms, mostly in the level Ghost Town, which actually involves Duke exploring abandoned town very similar to the aesthetic of Morningwood in this build. But there's also a multiplayer map in the final game called Morningwood, which shares the same western theme. In the final game, Duke explores the ghost town to try and find gas for his monster truck. The story is a little different in this early build. From this piece of placeholder dialogue, Duke is looking for someone named Bombshell. Like Gus, she was cut from the final game before its release, though she would make an appearance in her own self-titled game in 2016. Don't be surprised if you never heard of her game, as it didn't do too well. We also finally get to meet the almighty Gus and hear his interesting lines of dialogue.
You think them sunglasses make you look cool or something? Hey boy, get away from my ass!
The plot for this level is also very different, as Duke is trying to not only look for Bombshell, but also trying to save Gus from a prison cell. Bombshell is nowhere to be seen in this level, but Gus can actually be found twice, once beside this giant flesh worm, and once inside of this jail cell. The majority of this level revolves around trying to free Gus, which involves solving some kind of puzzle. A puzzle that, unsurprisingly, is not complete. Or I'm just too smooth-brained to be able to solve it, which is probably more likely. Ghost Town now takes a complete tonal shift as the rest of the levels take place in a secret underground laboratory. These levels are fairly expansive and similarly to many of the other levels have a lot of scenery but little in the way of content. As to why Duke is exploring this lab, I have no idea, but with how many worms appear in these levels, I'd say it's some kind of plot involving them. Especially since there is a whole level later in this episode where Duke fights his way through the insides of one of these giant worms. This level is visually one of the most interesting, and these goofy little cockroach fellas only make it better. A good amount of the worm's insides are also mapped out, but it's only the main level geometry, nothing else too interesting. Sadly, Booba level doesn't have any Booba, nor does it have any level at all. It just simply loads into a black screen. But we have something way more interesting than boobies. That's right, the first level from Duke Nukem 3D, Hollywood Holocaust. For some reason, most of this level has been ported over from Duke Nukem 3D, even with some of the level secrets intact. There's also a good amount of classic enemies populating the level as well. I'm not sure why the developers took the time to recreate this level. Maybe it was just a test level and the devs decided to copy an existing level to speed up dev time, or this could have been a special bonus level kind of like the retro ones in Doom 2016. At the end of this level is a load trigger which will take you into the next episode of the build, Rescue Mission. This episode takes place in Area 51 across 6 different levels. Each of these are fairly unique and have a lot of early puzzles built into them. In addition to these early puzzles, there are also some other obstacles and even a few NPCs here as well. All of this is pretty cool to see because the final game pretty much ends with the Hoover Dam. With how much there was made for this level, the original story probably had a lot more to it than what we got with the final game. The next episode in this build is Operation Shutdown, which I assume also takes place inside Area 51. Though there's no story elements from the design of the levels, we can assume it involves Duke shrinking down inside of a giant supercomputer. This whole shrinking gimmick carried over to the final game and was a pretty big focus of it as a matter of fact. I absolutely love the design of these levels. Becoming really tiny and exploring things that are way bigger than you is something I really enjoy, and this build does it really well. It also looks like there were plans for some kind of puzzle in this section. You can pick up this thingy, but you can't really do anything with it. And there are a number of laser walls that I would imagine the player had to turn off by solving the relevant puzzle. By no-clipping around these Area 51 levels, I was able to find a couple interesting game development secrets. In the first section of this level, there's a very reflective hallway. Actually rendering reflections like this is extremely taxing and requires a lot of processing power. What developers actually do is copy the existing geometry and mirror it upside down underneath a transparent floor. This provides accurate reflections while saving on processing power, though it looks like when clipping out of the map, the lower section is culled out. Culling is another game development trick where sections of the game world are removed to help reduce processing strain and keep the game running smoothly. Also, in the first level where Duke enters the computer, a pretty impressive skybox can be seen through the vents in the computer's casing. No clipping out of bounds, you can actually find a smaller, to-scale recreation of this map's skybox. Instead of fully rendering a giant office around the level, which would take a lot of processing power, developers will make a smaller version and just project it around the level environment. The final 2 levels of Operation Shutdown take place even further inside the computer, specifically inside of the software itself. The first of these is a visually stunning display of Duke zipping around through a virtual world before landing on a digital landscape, while the actual level is the second part. All of these levels, from the insides of the computer to traveling the virtual world, is something that I really would have liked to see in the final game. This whole premise is extremely unique and would have added a lot of depth to the pretty shallow experience we ended up getting. The final levels of this build are easily the least interesting. First up is Moon Patrol. I guess the original story saw Duke making his way all the way to the moon. This idea must have been scrapped pretty early into production because this is all there is. Pretty much the only thing here is this giant tower with a couple EDF cars placed about for good measure. The tower itself doesn't even have anything inside of it. I guess it's a bit impressive just how much of the lunar surface is rendered out. There's so much more moon here than what the level requires. Obviously, the developers had bigger plans for this level that never got implemented. The mothership is the final level and features 2 maps that are extremely bare bones in their design. The first map, as the game states, features a model of the mothership that is 1/4 of the actual size. With the level in Heatwave, it's masked with a color overlay, this one being black instead of beige. The level spawns you pretty far from the actual ship and you need to no-clip and fly over to it. Clipping inside of the ship's model causes the color overlay to disappear for a bit, but due to the angle, most of the model doesn't render properly and all you can see are a few tower-like structures. The next map is mostly similar, this time focusing on the ship's interior. As before, a gray overlay covers up all of the level geometry. Moving out of the bounds of the level removes it, and we can see a few of the map's details. A couple massive robots can be seen standing around in what I think is some kind of docking bay, and there are even some structures that look similar to skyscrapers, but I'd say these are just early models for crates or something. And with that, our exploration comes to a close. Not only does this build show us a lot of the process that goes into designing a game, but it also shows us that at one point, Duke Nukem Forever was a game with actual passion behind it, before it got buried by numerous company struggles and delays, and before Gearbox decided to dig up its rotting corpse and shove it out onto the market for money to cash out on the hype. We will never see what this game was intended to be. At least, not completely. I want to take this moment to shout out a project called the Duke Nukem Forever 2001 Restoration Project. It's being done by a team of modders on ModDB. Luckily, as I said before, this build came with all of the source code for the game intact, and these modders are digging into the game's files to try and restore the game to the original state that 3D Realms had planned for it. Currently, the team is working on completing the first chapter of the game High Stakes Lady Killer, the beginning part of the build that takes place inside of the casino. The team is actively recruiting new members and has even cast the amazing Gianni Matrigrano as the king himself. If you'd like to check out the project or even apply to join the team, I've linked their ModDB page in the description below. Thank you so much for joining me on this little exploration through gaming history, and I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please do hit the like button, as it does help out the channel a lot, and hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss another video. Thank you again so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.